In the gently rolling landscape of central Illinois, where prairie grasses once murmured their ancient secrets to the passing wind, there stands a monument to a forgotten evil, one the Catholic Church has labored for more than a century to scrub from the historical record. From 1847 to 1862, at the prestigious Sacred Heart Seminary, the Midwest's most esteemed Catholic institution, 17 young priests and seminarians disappeared without a trace. According to church records, these men were simply reassigned to far-flung missions or sent away for extended periods of spiritual retreat. But a very different story has emerged from a trove of newly discovered correspondence, hidden for generations beneath the floorboards of the seminary's chapel. It is a tale of methodical abduction, human trafficking, and murder, one that reaches all the way to the highest corridors of ecclesiastical power. What makes this case especially harrowing is a theory now gaining traction among investigators, that the three men who ran Sacred Heart Seminary for 15 years were not priests at all. They were, in fact, Irish criminals who had murdered the original clergy and stolen their identities. For 150 years, the Vatican has kept these records sealed. But tonight, we pull back the veil on what truly transpired within those hallowed halls, where young men entered seeking a divine calling, only to find themselves sold into bondage or something far worse. Before we journey deeper into the shadows of Sacred Heart Seminary and the vanished souls within its walls, let me be clear, this channel is not for everyone. It is only for those bold enough to confront the darkest truths that institutions work so desperately to bury. If you are ready to hear revelations that may shake the very foundations of what you believe about religious authority, then hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Drop a comment and tell us what state or city you're listening from, because a story like this could have unfolded anywhere in America during those lawless, untamed years. Now, let us step back to 1847 and uncover how a house of God was transformed into a marketplace for human souls. But to truly grasp the horror that unfolded at Sacred Heart, we must first understand the world that gave rise to it, and the desperate times that made such profound evil possible. The year 1847 marked a pivotal moment in American Catholic history, setting the stage perfectly for the nightmare that would unfold at Sacred Heart Seminary. As Irish immigrants fled the devastating potato famine, which had already claimed over 1 million lives in their homeland, they poured into American cities by the hundreds of thousands. They carried with them an unshakable devotion to their faith, but also drew a fierce suspicion from their Protestant neighbors, who viewed Catholicism as foreign, dangerous, and fundamentally un-American. Anti-Catholic sentiment ran so high that entire cities would erupt in riots at the mere whisper of Catholic influence. In Philadelphia, nativist mobs burned Catholic churches and schools to the ground, leaving 13 dead and 50 wounded. In Charlestown, Massachusetts, a Protestant crowd destroyed an Ursuline convent, forcing nuns to flee for their lives through back windows as their sacred buildings went up in flames behind them. Catholic priests were tarred and feathered in broad daylight with alarming regularity, and Catholic families lived in perpetual fear that their own neighbors might turn violent at any moment. It was within this hostile landscape that the Catholic Church found itself in desperate need of American-born priests, men who could speak without an accent, who understood local customs, and who could act as bridges between the immigrant masses and their new homeland. Church leaders recognized that foreign-born clergy, no matter how educated or devout, would always be met with suspicion by the Protestant Americans who controlled local governments, law enforcement, and businesses. Sacred Heart Seminary, established in 1845 on 400 acres of untouched Illinois prairie, 40 miles southwest of Chicago, was designed to be that bridge. It was meant to be a place where young American men could be trained for the priesthood under the guidance of educated European clergy, producing a new generation of priests capable of navigating both worlds. For its time, the seminary was an architectural marvel. Designed by Irish architect Patrick Keeley, already renowned for his Gothic revival churches across New England, the main building rose from the prairie as a massive 3-story brick structure. It stood like a cathedral, with soaring windows nearly 20 feet high, hand-carved wooden pews imported from Bavaria, and a bell tower whose chimes could be heard for miles across the flat landscape on a clear day. Constructed at the astronomical cost of $40,000, more than most Illinois towns were worth at the time, the building was funded entirely by donations from wealthy Catholic families in Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. These families saw the seminary as essential to the survival of their faith in America. Among the donors were Patrick Murphy, who had made his fortune in Great Lakes shipping, Francis O'Brien, owner of Milwaukee's largest brewery, and Margaret Connolly, the widow of a Chicago real estate magnate, who contributed $8,000 on her own, more money than most families would see in a lifetime. The seminary's library held over 3,000 volumes, including rare theological texts, classical literature, and scientific works, one of the finest collections of learning west of the Mississippi. Modern amenities, unusual for a rural area, graced the building. Indoor plumbing drew water from a deep well. Gas lighting illuminated the main floors. A sophisticated heating system, with a central furnace and ductwork, kept the entire structure warm through Illinois' brutal winters. Father Superior Edmund Walsh arrived from County Cork in late 1846 to establish the seminary's academic program. A man of imposing stature, standing nearly 6'4" with penetrating gray eyes and a silver beard that reached almost to his chest, Walsh commanded attention wherever he went. He spoke with the cultured accent of Trinity College Dublin and carried letters of recommendation from bishops across Ireland, including an especially impressive testimonial from the Archbishop of Dublin himself. Walsh claimed to have studied theology at the prestigious Maynooth Seminary, where he allegedly earned highest honors in moral theology and canon law. His supposed academic credentials included advanced degrees in philosophy, classical languages, and church history, making him one of the most educated priests in the American Midwest. He spoke fluent Latin, Greek, French, and German. He could recite lengthy passages from St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas from memory. And he demonstrated an encyclopedic knowledge of church doctrine that impressed even the most learned bishops who interviewed him. Joining Walsh were Rector Thomas Murphy and Dean Patrick O'Brien, both equally impressive in their supposed qualifications and scholarly achievements. Murphy, a scholarly man in his early 40s with prematurely gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, allegedly held advanced degrees in philosophy and canon law from the University of Louvain in Belgium, one of Europe's most prestigious Catholic institutions. He claimed to have served as secretary to the Bishop of Cork and to have published several theological treatises well received by church scholars throughout Ireland and England. Dean Patrick O'Brien was younger than the others, perhaps 35, but equally compelling with his supposed background in classical languages and church history from the Royal University of Ireland. O'Brien was particularly skilled in rhetoric and homiletics. His sermons moved listeners to tears, and he had a gift for explaining complex theological concepts in language ordinary people could understand. His claim to have served as chaplain to wealthy Irish families gave him knowledge of aristocratic customs and refined manners that impressed American Catholic society. Together, the three men projected an image of intellectual authority, spiritual devotion, and cultural sophistication that swayed even the most skeptical church officials. Bishop William Corder of Chicago, who held ultimate authority over Sacred Heart Seminary, was so convinced of their qualifications that he granted them unprecedented autonomy in shaping the institution's policies and procedures. In the fall of 1847, the seminary welcomed its first class, 12 young men, ages 18 to 25, drawn from Catholic families across the Midwest, families who had sacrificed greatly to afford this education. They came from diverse backgrounds. Heinrich Müller and Johann Weber were sons of German immigrants in Milwaukee, whose families had pooled resources to send them. Patrick Kelly and Sean Malley came from prosperous Irish families in Chicago, who saw the priesthood as a path to social respectability. Antoine Du Bois arrived from a French family in Detroit that had grown wealthy in the fur trade. And then there were Thomas Morrison and David Anderson, converts from Protestant families who had embraced Catholicism despite fierce opposition from their relatives. These young men arrived with hearts full of religious devotion and minds eager to serve God, completely unaware that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap, months in the planning. Each student had been selected according to specific criteria established by the three false priests: family wealth sufficient to pay substantial tuition, physical strength suitable for heavy labor, educational background that would make them valuable in skilled positions, and social isolation that would make their disappearance easier to explain and harder to investigate. On the surface, the daily routine at Sacred Heart followed traditional seminary practices established by centuries of Catholic education. Students rose at 4:30 a.m. for lauds, the first prayer service of the day. They attended Mass at 5 a.m. in the seminary's magnificent chapel, and their days unfolded in a carefully structured rhythm of prayer, study, and manual labor maintaining the seminary's extensive grounds. Their academic curriculum was rigorous and comprehensive. It included Latin grammar and composition, Greek language and literature, philosophy covering ancient and medieval thought, systematic theology examining church doctrine, church history from the apostolic age to the present, moral theology addressing ethical questions, canon law governing church administration, homiletics teaching sermon preparation and delivery, and biblical studies focusing on both Old and New Testaments. The three priests maintained strict discipline and insisted on absolute obedience to authority, a requirement they justified as essential preparation for the hierarchical nature of church leadership. Students were forbidden from leaving the seminary grounds without written permission, from corresponding with family more than once a month, and from discussing seminary affairs with outsiders during their rare visits to the nearby town of Milford. This isolation was presented as spiritual necessity, but it served a darker purpose, preventing students from developing outside relationships that might interfere with the trafficking operation. The priests carefully monitored all incoming and outgoing mail, ostensibly to ensure students maintained proper spiritual focus, but actually to control information flow and prevent any communication that might expose their criminal activities. The first disappearance occurred on a bitter February morning in 1848, just 5 months after the seminary opened, during one of the worst blizzards in Illinois history. For 3 days, snow had fallen continuously, piling into drifts that reached the second-story windows of the seminary building and making travel impossible on the surrounding roads. It was precisely the kind of weather the false priests had been waiting for, conditions that would provide perfect cover for their operation while making immediate investigation impossible. Michael Brennan, a 22-year-old from a prosperous Irish family in Chicago, had shown particular promise in his theological studies. Father Walsh had selected him to assist with special administrative duties that required access to the seminary's financial records and correspondence files. His family owned 3 successful grocery stores serving Chicago's growing Irish community and had paid the substantial sum of $200 per year for his education, money they had saved for over 5 years, believing they were investing in their son's future as a priest and in their own family's standing in the community. Michael had written to his family just days before his disappearance, describing his joy at being selected for advanced responsibilities and his excitement about beginning specialized studies in moral theology. His letter, later found among Walsh's papers, spoke of his deep gratitude for his parents' sacrifice and his determination to serve God and the Irish community with distinction. The letter bore no hint of distress, doubt, or any desire to leave the seminary. On the evening of February 13, 1848, Michael was summoned to Father Walsh's private office after the evening meal. Several students remembered seeing him walk down the corridor toward Walsh's office around 8:30 p.m., carrying a small leather portfolio containing his academic work. The office was in a remote section of the seminary's administrative wing, separated from the student dormitories by thick stone walls that muffled sound transmission. According to later testimony from students questioned about that evening, raised voices could be heard coming from Walsh's office sometime around 9 p.m., though the specific words were indistinguishable. The argument, for that's what it clearly was, continued for nearly an hour, with periods of silence punctuated by shouting that seemed to involve multiple voices. Around 10:15 p.m., the sound ceased abruptly, and an unsettling quiet settled over the administrative wing. Joseph Kennedy, Michael's roommate and closest friend at the seminary, waited until nearly midnight for Michael to return to their shared dormitory room. When Michael failed to appear by morning prayers at 4:30 a.m., Joseph assumed his friend had been given permission to sleep late due to his administrative duties. It wasn't until Father Walsh announced to the assembled students after morning mass that Joseph learned the official explanation for Michael's absence. Standing at the ornate wooden pulpit that dominated the seminary chapel, Walsh delivered the news with apparent sorrow and concern. Michael, he explained, had received an urgent call during the night to minister to cholera victims in a remote settlement near the Iowa border. The disease had struck a small Catholic community, and their local priest had died, leaving the faithful without spiritual guidance during their hour of greatest need. Michael, despite his youth and incomplete training, had volunteered for this dangerous mission, demonstrating the kind of selfless courage that marked a true priestly calling. Walsh's explanation seemed reasonable on the surface, especially given the genuine cholera outbreaks that periodically devastated frontier communities during the 1840s. Cholera was a terrifying disease that could kill healthy adults within hours, and priests who ministered to victims faced almost certain death themselves. The image of young Michael sacrificing his safety to serve God and the faithful was exactly the kind of heroic narrative that inspired other seminarians and reinforced their own sense of calling. However, Joseph Kennedy noticed troubling details that didn't align with the official story. Most obviously, Michael's heavy winter coat remained hanging in their shared wardrobe, along with his warmest boots and thick woolen gloves, items absolutely essential for travel during an Illinois February, especially to reach a remote settlement in Iowa. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero the previous night, making survival impossible for anyone traveling without proper winter clothing. Even more disturbing, Michael had mentioned nothing to Joseph about any possible call to ministry, despite the two young men sharing their deepest spiritual thoughts and concerns every evening before sleep. They had discussed their future plans just the night before Michael's disappearance, and Michael had spoken enthusiastically about his administrative work and his hopes of specializing in moral theology. He had shown no signs of restlessness, dissatisfaction, or desire for immediate ministry experience. Joseph also noticed that Michael's personal belongings remained exactly as he had left them, including his most treasured possession, a silver rosary that had belonged to his grandmother, who had died during the Irish potato famine. Michael had never been seen without this rosary since arriving at the seminary, and Joseph found it inconceivable that his friend would depart for dangerous missionary work without taking this sacred family heirloom. When Joseph privately questioned Father Walsh about these inconsistencies the following day, the priest's reaction was swift, severe, and completely disproportionate to the nature of the inquiry. Walsh accused Joseph of harboring prideful curiosity, incompatible with proper religious obedience, and dangerous skepticism toward legitimate church authority. Such attitudes, Walsh warned, could lead to spiritual corruption and ultimate damnation if not corrected through severe penance and spiritual discipline. As punishment for his presumptuous questioning, Joseph was assigned to spend the next week in solitary prayer and fasting in the seminary's basement chapel, a damp, windowless room beneath the main structure where students were sent to contemplate their spiritual failings and seek God's forgiveness. The basement chapel was carved directly into the hillside beneath the seminary, accessible only through a narrow stone staircase that descended from the main building's rear entrance. The basement chapel was a deliberately uncomfortable space designed to encourage genuine repentance through physical hardship. The walls were rough-hewn stone that wept moisture continuously, creating an atmosphere of perpetual dampness that chilled to the bone. The only light came from candles that students were required to maintain themselves, and the only warmth came from a small brazier that provided minimal heat during the worst winter weather. During his week of isolation in this underground chamber, Joseph experienced something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Late at night, usually around 2 a.m., when the seminary was supposed to be completely silent, he could hear the unmistakable sounds of horses' hooves and wagon wheels on the frozen ground outside the basement chapel. The sounds were clear and distinct despite the thick stone walls, suggesting that the activity was taking place directly above his underground prison. The nocturnal activity followed a consistent pattern that became more disturbing with each occurrence. First came the sound of horses approaching from the direction of the main road, moving slowly and carefully, as if the drivers were familiar with the terrain but wanted to avoid making unnecessary noise. Next came voices speaking in hushed tones, always the same three voices that Joseph recognized as belonging to Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, though he could never make out their specific words through the stone ceiling. The conversations typically lasted about 15 minutes, followed by the sounds of heavy objects being moved, dragging noises, grunting sounds suggesting physical exertion, and the creaking of wagon springs adjusting to shifting weight. During these periods, Joseph could see lantern light flickering through the basement chapel's single dirt-encrusted window, casting moving shadows on the stone walls that suggested multiple figures working in coordination. The entire process typically took about an hour, always ending with the sound of wagon wheels departing in the direction opposite from their arrival, toward the road leading to Springfield rather than Chicago. After the wagons departed, complete silence would return to the seminary, and the next morning would proceed exactly as if nothing unusual had occurred. On the third night of his confinement, Joseph positioned himself directly beneath the basement chapel's window and managed to catch a clearer glimpse of the activity above. Through the dirty glass, he could see the silhouettes of three men loading what appeared to be a large, heavy bundle into the back of a covered wagon. The bundle was wrapped in dark cloth and required all three men to lift, suggesting considerable weight. Most chilling was the care with which they handled their burden, not the rough treatment appropriate for cargo or supplies, but the cautious movements used when transporting something precious or fragile. The second disappearance came just 6 weeks after Michael Brennan's vanishing, and this time the pattern became impossible for observant students to ignore. Thomas Gallagher, the 20-year-old son of a German immigrant family from Milwaukee, was universally regarded by his fellow students as the gentlest, most devout member of their class. He spent extra hours in private prayer, helped struggling classmates with their Latin translations, and had never been known to raise his voice or express anger about anything. Thomas came from a family that embodied the American dream through hard work and sacrifice. His father, Klaus Gallagher, originally Klaus Muller before anglicizing his name upon arrival in America, had started as a day laborer in Milwaukee's growing brewery industry and had worked his way up to become foreman of one of the city's largest operations. His mother, Anna, took in sewing and laundry to supplement the family income, working 16-hour days to help save money for Thomas's seminary education. The Gallaghers had sacrificed enormously to afford Sacred Heart's tuition, selling their small farm outside Milwaukee and moving into a cramped tenement apartment so they could dedicate every possible dollar to their son's religious calling. Thomas carried the weight of his family's sacrifice heavily, frequently expressing to fellow students his determination to justify their faith in him and to serve God with the dedication their generosity deserved. On the evening of March 30, 1848, Thomas was summoned to Father Walsh's private office immediately after evening prayers. The summons came through Dean Patrick O'Brien, who approached Thomas in the seminary chapel with an unusually grave expression and whispered instructions that he was needed for urgent consultation regarding his academic progress. Thomas appeared confused by the summons, telling his closest friend Heinrich Weber that he was unaware of any problems with his studies and couldn't imagine what urgent matter required immediate attention. Several students positioned in dormitory rooms near the administrative wing reported hearing raised voices coming from Walsh's office beginning around 9 p.m. and continuing intermittently until nearly 11 p.m. The conversation appeared to involve multiple participants, with periods of calm discussion interrupted by what sounded like arguments or heated disagreements. Students later testified that they heard Thomas's voice at several points, sounding distressed and increasingly agitated as the evening progressed. Around 10:30 p.m., long after the seminary's mandatory evening silence was supposed to begin, Heinrich Weber and 2 other students reported hearing what sounded like furniture being moved or overturned in Walsh's office, followed by a period of complete silence that lasted nearly 30 minutes. Then around 11 p.m., they heard the familiar sound of a horse-drawn wagon departing from behind the seminary building, traveling slowly with muffled wheels, as if the drivers were attempting to minimize noise. The next morning, Father Walsh announced during Mass that Thomas had experienced what he termed a profound spiritual crisis during their evening consultation. Thomas had confessed to struggling with impure thoughts incompatible with a priestly vocation and had reached the painful conclusion that he was not suited for religious life. Rather than face the shame of public failure, Thomas had voluntarily left the seminary before dawn to join a contemplative monastery in the Wisconsin wilderness, where years of silence and isolation would help him overcome his spiritual struggles and perhaps eventually qualify him for a different form of religious service. Walsh's explanation was crafted with psychological sophistication, playing upon common fears and anxieties that many seminary students experienced. Sexual temptation was a genuine struggle for young men committed to celibacy, and the shame associated with such feelings often led to extreme measures of self-punishment and isolation. The idea of a troubled student seeking redemption through monastic retreat was entirely plausible and consistent with traditional Catholic approaches to spiritual crisis. However, as with Michael Brennan's disappearance, troubling details emerged for those who looked closely at the official explanation. Thomas had left behind his most precious possession, a rosary hand-carved by his dying mother, which he had never been seen without since arriving at the seminary 8 months earlier. The rosary was found carefully placed on his dormitory desk, suggesting deliberate placement rather than forgotten abandonment. Even more suspicious, Thomas had departed so suddenly that he hadn't collected the $50 in personal funds that his family had provided for incidental expenses, money that remained locked in Father Walsh's office safe. For a family that had sacrificed so much to afford seminary tuition, abandoning $50 represented a financial loss that would have significant impact on their daily survival. Most disturbing of all was a letter Thomas had been writing to his younger sister Maria, which remained unfinished on his desk. The letter stopped mid-sentence in a description of his joy at serving God and his excitement about beginning advanced theological studies in the coming term. The final line read, "I wake each morning grateful to God for guiding me to this holy place where I grow closer to Him each day, and I cannot imagine any life more blessed than the one He has." The sentence ended abruptly, as if Thomas had been interrupted while writing. Heinrich Weber, Thomas's closest friend at the seminary, found the incomplete letter particularly disturbing because Thomas had shared the contents with him the evening before his disappearance. Thomas had been enthusiastic about describing to Maria his progress in theological studies and his growing confidence in his calling to the priesthood. He had planned to finish the letter the following day and had specifically mentioned wanting to tell Maria about a particularly inspiring lecture Father Walsh had delivered on moral theology. Word of the disappearances began to spread among the remaining students, though always in whispers and never in the presence of the 3 priests. The student body of originally 12 had now lost 2 members in just 6 weeks, and the official explanations, while individually plausible, began to seem suspicious when considered together. Some students defended the priest's accounts, arguing that God's call could come suddenly and that true devotion sometimes required abandoning worldly attachments, including family relationships and material possessions. Others, however, began to notice patterns that filled them with growing unease. Both Michael and Thomas had been among the most financially well-off students. Both had demonstrated exceptional academic promise that made them valuable additions to any religious community, and both had been called to private meetings with Father Walsh shortly before their departures. Additionally, both had left behind personal possessions that seemed inconsistent with voluntary departure, and both had shown no previous signs of doubt, distress, or desire to leave the seminary. The atmosphere at Sacred Heart began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. Students became more guarded in their conversations, more careful about expressing opinions or asking questions that might be interpreted as challenging authority. The easy camaraderie that had characterized the seminary's early months gave way to an undercurrent of anxiety and suspicion that affected every aspect of daily life. As the harsh Illinois winter gradually gave way to spring, the disappearances at Sacred Heart Seminary continued with terrifying regularity that revealed the systematic nature of the operation. By Christmas of 1848, 5 more young men had vanished from the institution. Each departure was accompanied by increasingly elaborate explanations from the 3 false priests, demonstrating their growing confidence in their ability to manipulate both students and outside authorities. The third disappearance involved Antoine Du Bois, the French seminarian from Detroit whose family had made their fortune in the fur trade. Antoine possessed valuable skills in wilderness survival, animal tracking, and Native American languages that made him particularly attractive to buyers seeking workers for frontier operations. He vanished during a supposed emergency call to minister to a remote French settlement that was allegedly under threat from hostile Native American tribes. The fourth was Heinrich Weber, Thomas Gallagher's closest friend, who had begun asking too many questions about his roommate's sudden departure. Heinrich was reportedly transferred to a specialized seminary in Baltimore that focused on preparing priests for German immigrant communities, a transfer that required such secrecy that he was forbidden from saying goodbye to his fellow students or writing to inform his family until he was safely established in his new location. By the end of 1848, the student body had shrunk from 12 to 7, and those who remained lived in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing who might be next to receive the dreaded summons to Father Walsh's office. The survivors developed an unspoken system of mutual protection, noting who was called away for private meetings and making mental inventories of their fellow students' most valued possessions as a way of monitoring whose departure might be imminent. Joseph Kennedy, who had witnessed the first disappearance of his roommate Michael and had endured a week of solitary confinement for questioning the official explanation, found himself unable to concentrate on his theological studies. The memory of those late-night sounds from the basement chapel haunted him, and he began paying careful attention to patterns and details that he had previously dismissed as unimportant. Joseph noticed that disappearances always occurred during specific weather conditions, cold, overcast nights when travel would be difficult but concealment would be easier. They typically happened during the week rather than on weekends, when visiting family members or church officials might be present on the seminary grounds. Most significantly, they always followed private meetings with Father Walsh that lasted significantly longer than normal academic consultations. The surviving students also began to observe changes in the three priests that seemed inconsistent with their claimed backgrounds and spiritual calling. Father Walsh, who had arrived at Sacred Heart with modest belongings and simple clerical garments, now wore silk vestments during Mass that had obviously cost more than most priests earned in a year. He had acquired an expensive gold pocket watch manufactured in Switzerland, which he consulted frequently during his lectures, and had purchased new furniture for his private office that included a mahogany desk imported from Ireland. Rector Murphy had somehow obtained funds to purchase new leather-bound books for the seminary library, volumes that cost more than most families earned in a month, and included rare theological works that would normally be found only in major European universities. He had also begun wearing spectacles with gold frames and had acquired a seal ring that he claimed bore his family coat of arms, though none of the Irish students recognized the symbols as belonging to any legitimate Irish family. Dean O'Brien had perhaps shown the most dramatic change in circumstances, acquiring a magnificent black stallion that he claimed was a gift from grateful parishioners in his former parish in Ireland. The horse was clearly a thoroughbred worth several $100s, and O'Brien demonstrated riding skills that seemed more appropriate to a wealthy landowner than a humble parish priest. He had also begun taking regular trips to Chicago, ostensibly for church business, but always returning with new possessions and an air of satisfaction that suggested successful commercial transactions rather than spiritual consultations. The three men also began taking frequent trips away from the seminary, sometimes for several days at a time, claiming to visit church officials in Chicago, Milwaukee, or St. Louis. During these absences, the remaining students were supervised by Francis McManus, the elderly lay brother who had arrived at Sacred Heart at the same time as the three priests and seemed to serve as their assistant and confidant. McManus was a peculiar figure who generated considerable unease among the students. He spoke very little, moved with a furtive, nervous manner, and seemed perpetually frightened of something he never identified. When students attempted to engage him in conversation about his background or his work at the seminary, he would become visibly agitated and refuse to answer direct questions. Most disturbing was his reaction whenever anyone mentioned the missing students. He would immediately change the subject or find urgent work that required him to leave the area. Several students noticed that McManus possessed detailed knowledge of the seminary's grounds that suggested extensive familiarity with areas that were supposedly off-limits to everyone except the priests. He knew the locations of storage areas, root cellars, and outbuildings that were never mentioned in official tours of the facility. He also demonstrated knowledge of the surrounding countryside that seemed inconsistent with his claimed role as a religious assistant who rarely left the seminary grounds. Perhaps most disturbing was the seminary's correspondence with the outside world, which revealed a level of control and deception that suggested careful planning and systematic implementation. Family members who wrote to inquire about their sons received responses on official Sacred Heart letterhead, but the handwriting was always that of Father Walsh, never the students themselves. The letters followed consistent patterns that seemed designed to discourage further inquiry while providing plausible explanations for reduced communication. When parents requested specific information about their son's well-being, academic progress, or daily activities, they were told that advanced theological studies required periods of spiritual silence during which students were forbidden from worldly communication that might distract from their religious development. Families who asked for direct letters from their sons were informed that such correspondence would be permitted only after successful completion of specific spiritual milestones, which might take months or years to achieve. The local community in the nearby town of Milford, population barely 300, began to whisper about strange occurrences near the seminary that seemed inconsistent with the quiet, contemplative atmosphere appropriate to a religious institution. Farmers reported seeing covered wagons traveling at odd hours along the rarely used road that connected Sacred Heart to the main highway toward Chicago, always moving slowly and carefully, as if attempting to avoid detection. Samuel Morrison, who owned the farm adjacent to the seminary property, claimed to have found personal items scattered along the fence line that separated his land from the seminary grounds. The items included a prayer book with Michael Brennan written inside the front cover, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles that had belonged to Heinrich Weber, and a silver crucifix that several people recognized as having been worn by Thomas Gallagher. When Morrison attempted to return these items to the seminary, Father Walsh claimed they had been deliberately discarded by students who were learning to abandon worldly attachments as part of their spiritual development. The winter of 1849 to 1850 brought a series of events that would fundamentally transform the nature of the mystery surrounding Sacred Heart Seminary and reveal the true scope of the horror that had been unfolding behind the facade of religious education. The seminary's isolation during Illinois' brutal winter months created perfect conditions for the criminals to accelerate their operations while making detection or escape virtually impossible for their victims. James O'Malley, a seminary student from Detroit whose father was a prosperous merchant with extensive connections throughout the Great Lakes region, had grown increasingly suspicious of the priest's explanations for his missing classmates. Unlike the other students, who came primarily from working-class immigrant families with limited resources and political influence, James had connections to influential Catholics in multiple cities, including his uncle, Father Patrick O'Malley, who served as secretary to the Bishop of Detroit and corresponded regularly with church officials throughout the Midwest. James possessed advantages that made him particularly dangerous to the trafficking operation. His family's wealth meant that his disappearance would be noticed and investigated by people with the resources to pursue inquiries across state lines. His uncle's position in the church hierarchy provided access to communication networks that could bypass local control and reach authorities in Rome if necessary. Most importantly, James had received a classical education that included training in logic, rhetoric, and investigation techniques, making him capable of systematic analysis and evidence gathering. Beginning in the fall of 1849, James started conducting his own investigation into the disappearances, carefully documenting discrepancies in the priest's stories and maintaining detailed records of which students had disappeared and under what circumstances. He created a detailed timeline that revealed patterns invisible to casual observation, including the fact that all disappearances had occurred during specific weather conditions and that the official explanations contained internal contradictions that became obvious when examined systematically. James noticed that the three priests seemed to possess detailed knowledge of each student's family financial situation, information that would normally be kept confidential in church records and would only be available to someone who had conducted thorough investigations into each family's background. The priests knew which students came from wealthy families, which had agricultural land that could be used as collateral, and which had relatives in other cities who might provide assistance in times of crisis. Most significantly, James discovered that the seminary's financial records contained discrepancies that suggested income far exceeding what would be expected from tuition payments alone. By carefully observing the priests' spending patterns and comparing them to the seminary's official budget, James calculated that Sacred Heart was generating several $1,000s in unexplained revenue each year, money that had to be coming from sources other than student fees or church donations. The breakthrough in James's investigation came in December 1849, when he discovered a cache of letters hidden beneath loose floorboards in the seminary's library, concealed in a space that appeared to have been deliberately constructed to hide documents from casual inspection. The hiding place was sophisticated, involving a section of flooring that could be removed only by manipulating specific boards in a precise sequence, suggesting that it had been designed by someone with detailed knowledge of carpentry and security techniques. The letters, written in various hands and bearing postmarks from cities across the Midwest, appeared to be communications between Father Walsh and unknown correspondents who were clearly involved in commercial transactions of some kind. The correspondence was written in a peculiar code that mixed legitimate business terminology with religious language in ways that seemed designed to disguise the true nature of the discussions. James spent weeks analyzing the coded language, using his classical education and knowledge of multiple languages to decipher meanings that became increasingly horrifying as he understood more of the system. The letters discussed merchandise of varying quality and negotiated delivery schedules to locations in Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. References to prime specimens, educational background, and physical condition made it clear that the merchandise was human beings, being evaluated and sold based on their characteristics and capabilities. One letter, dated November 15, 1849, contained references that made James's blood run cold and confirmed his worst suspicions about what had happened to his missing classmates. The letter read in part, the latest shipment included 2 prime specimens, both young and strong, suitable for heavy labor. The German boy brought a premium price due to his education and physical condition. Buyers in the coal regions are particularly interested in educated workers who can serve as overseers for immigrant crews. The Irish lad was sold separately to lumber interests in Wisconsin, where his literacy skills make him valuable for record keeping. Both transactions completed without complications. James realized he was looking at evidence of human trafficking on a massive scale, with his missing classmates being systematically sold as slaves to mining operations, lumber companies, and industrial concerns across the Midwest. The letters indicated that educated young men, particularly those from Catholic families, commanded high prices because their religious training made them trustworthy overseers, while their social isolation made their disappearances easier to explain and harder to investigate. The correspondence revealed that the operation was far more sophisticated than a simple kidnapping scheme. The criminals had established networks of buyers throughout multiple states, had developed systems for transporting victims without detection, and had created elaborate cover stories that could withstand casual investigation by family members or church officials. Further analysis of the letters revealed pricing structures that treated human beings as commodities to be evaluated and sold based on market demand. Young men with theological education commanded prices between $300 and $500, depending on their physical condition, language skills, and family background. Those with specialized knowledge, carpentry, bookkeeping, or foreign languages, brought premium prices of up to $800. Most chilling was a reference to damaged goods that had to be permanently disposed of when they proved unsuitable for resale. Armed with this evidence, James attempted to contact church authorities outside Sacred Heart to report his discoveries. However, he quickly discovered that his correspondence was being intercepted and read before being sent. When he tried to send a coded message to his uncle in Detroit using Latin phrases that would be meaningless to casual readers but would alert Father Patrick to serious problems, the letter was returned to him with a note from Father Walsh claiming that ecclesiastical correspondence required official review to ensure proper theological content. James realized that he was trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation. The 3 criminals now knew that he suspected something, and they had demonstrated their willingness to murder anyone who threatened their operation. His only hope lay in gathering enough evidence to expose the entire network before they decided to eliminate him, as they had eliminated others who had grown too suspicious. The confrontation that James had been dreading came on a frigid January evening in 1850, when Father Walsh summoned him to his private office after evening prayers. James entered the meeting knowing that his life was in immediate danger but hoping that his family connections and social position might provide some protection against the immediate violence that had claimed his classmates. The office had been transformed since James's last visit several months earlier. Expensive carpets covered the stone floor. Oil paintings in elaborate gold frames decorated the walls. The massive mahogany desk was covered with papers and ledgers that suggested extensive business activities. Most ominous was the presence of Dean O'Brien and Rector Murphy, who stood flanking Walsh's desk like bodyguards rather than fellow priests. Walsh's demeanor during the confrontation was completely different from the pastoral, scholarly persona he maintained in public. Speaking in the harsh accent of Dublin's criminal districts, he dropped all pretense of religious authority and addressed James with the calculating coldness of a businessman protecting a profitable enterprise. "You've been asking questions that could be dangerous for your health," Walsh said, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. Young men who don't understand their place have been known to suffer unfortunate accidents in these isolated areas. The threat was explicit and unambiguous, but James detected something in Walsh's manner that suggested the criminals were not entirely confident in their ability to eliminate him without consequences. His family's wealth and connections meant that his disappearance would trigger investigations that might prove difficult to deflect. With the